Okay, so today we are talking about stuff that consumes this and turns it into this. Okay, so as you saw in the intro, we are talking about yeast, and I've had a lot of requests lately regarding yeast and what yeast does and how do I use yeast and what yeast should I use, and it's actually a very simple subject that can get very confusing very quickly if you start overthinking it. So what I will be doing today is I will be running over the basics of the different types of yeast strains, and not the different strains actually, but just the different type of yeast you can use depending on what you want to do with it and what kind of result you want. We will also be making my yeast starter, or how can we put it, the continuous yeast producing jug. Okay, so it's a jug that you're going to use, that you're going to keep on feeding, and it's just going to keep producing yeast for you to use. It all starts with less than 1 packet of yeast and some sugar water. So yeah, let's first, before we get into the different types of yeast, start with our yeast starter. So what we're going to do is we're first going to take some sugar and we are going to dissolve it in some water. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to invert those sugars so that the yeast has an easier job to consume those sugars and they stay healthier. So yeah, let's get into that. Okay, so we now quickly got all these ingredients in the pot. So it is a little bit of water. Doesn't matter how much water, just make sure it's enough to dissolve your sugar and not make it a syrup. So that's about a cup of water that I added into my small little pot. Then what I did is I added 2 tablespoons of sugar, and I'm going to be adding now 1/4 teaspoon of citric acid. So that goes in, and what we are doing is we are taking a acid base and we are now using it to split the bond between the sucrose. The sucrose we want to turn into fructose and glucose by using heat and acid. So that is inverting your sugar and turning it into fructose and glucose. So yeah, that means we are now using heat and acid to split that bond. It's a really easy bond to split, but that one simple step when doing your sugar washes or when doing your yeast starter will give your yeast an easier time to consume the sugars. So yeah, let's get that boiling and then get back to the yeast. It's time for a quick booze break, and then we're going to quickly talk about the different types of yeast that we will be using within our distilling. Okay, so this is the brandy we made a couple of days ago. If you are interested in the recipe, I will link it in the card up top, so you can see it gained some nice color and it smells fantastic. Add some Coke. And cheers. Had some nice brandy. Okay, so while I'm enjoying some of the fruits of my labor, this is probably one of the subjects that I've been asked about the most is what yeast do I use, what kind of yeast do I use, what result will I get when I use the specific yeast, is it worth it to use this kind of yeast? And the answer is it depends. Okay, cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you guys a quick overview of the different types of yeast and what they will do for you. This is bread yeast. Now bread yeast, brewer's yeast, distiller's yeast, they produce alcohol, and the alcohol is produced as a byproduct when the yeast consumes sugar, and that is what we want. We want alcohol within a liquid so we can distill it out. Okay, that's the basics of it. First up, bread yeast, a Saccharomyces strain of yeast. Within Saccharomyces there is a plethora of different yeasts, and this video is not about talking about the different types of yeast and the flavors that you're going to get out of the yeast and that. This is just a brief overview of the different yeasts and how I use them. Okay, cool. So let's start with the most basic and easily available yeast that you will get all year round at any store, doesn't matter the size of the store, is a standard bread yeast. Now the standard bread yeast is a very common yeast used in the distilling world. You can expect 6 to 8% ABV once you are done distilling. So that is on your hydrometer between a 1040 and a 1060. Okay, so that will be in between that range of dissolvable sugars within your wash. Yes, you can stretch the yeast further and get more alcohol out of it, because remember, yeast is a living organism. It does not listen to what you are saying. It does not read the instructions on the side of the pack. It can go anything up to about 15-16% on your normal bread yeast. If you do everything correctly, the yeast is happy and all the other stuff. Yes, you can do that. But this video is not about what you can do with the yeast. It's just how I use my yeast. Okay, so like I said, bread yeast, 6 to 8%, we cap it there. Why do I do that? It's so I don't stress my yeast. I have a clear indication of what kind of flavors I will be getting from the yeast, and I have a set period of time that the yeast should function in to get to that point so I can put it through my still. Okay, simple. Next up, we're talking about not so easily available currently, but generally easily available is our brewer's yeast within the South African market. Now this is once again a strain of Saccharomyces yeast, but this is a yeast that can produce or survive in a higher alcohol content wort. So this yeast here, you can comfortably go to about 12 to 14% ABV. Anything higher than that and you are going to be starting to stress the yeast, and once you start stressing yeast, what will happen is the fermentation will take longer, you will get funny flavors, or the yeast will not produce, and then you will be left with a whole bunch of excess sugar in your wash that you don't want. This is 10 to let's say 10 to 14% or 12 to 14% to be safe. Then we are moving into our distiller strain yeast. Now the distiller strain yeast here, this is a brand called Bootleggers. It was sent to me by Nico from Bootleggers, which we'll be making on the channel a little bit later in the week or in next week. We will be making a nice cognac. This yeast here, it states on the packaging it can do up to about 15% ABV. According to the packet, it is a tequila and brandy or a fruit wash yeast, meaning it's going to focus on the fruity flavors. And then we have this liquid culture liquid yeast here. As you can see, I kept it in a nice cold ice bath to ensure that the yeast doesn't start activating, because this yeast here is rated to go to 25% ABV. That's a bucket load of sugar in water that this will convert. So 25% ABV is higher then people generally stop for their tails when distilling. So this will produce a buttload of alcohol. And that's the plan with this yeast here. We are recording a video where we will be making or attempting to make a buttload of alcohol using this yeast. Just to give you a quick idea, it's about 30 kilograms of sugar we will be using. Next up, on the yeast side, let's just make it sip. Your bread yeast. Why distillers like bread yeast? Other than that it is cheap and readily available, tongue tied, it can withstand a huge temperature range. So anything from about 20 degrees to about 30 degrees, this yeast will thrive and it will reproduce. Remember, the higher you go in temperature, the faster the yeast reproduce and the funnier the flavors become. Okay, but at about 25 degrees centigrade, this yeast will be happy. It will reproduce. So in South Africa during the summer within your house or in your lapa or whatever, this yeast will be very happy and it will produce without you having to control the temperature. Okay, and yeah, like I said, it has a very stable yeast and it works like a charm. Next up, your brewer's yeast that you can buy. Okay, this is not a specialty yeast by any stretch of the imagination. It's just a higher ABV form. It can handle temperatures anything from about 23 degrees up to about 30 degrees. Anything above 30 degrees, then the yeast starts slowing down or even stopping. Anything below 30 degrees, around about 28 degrees, this yeast will thrive. So once again, this yeast is ideal for our purposes when we do not have temperature control and all of those funny things that you need to ensure that your yeast stays active, because that's one of the big reasons why a fermentation does not complete, its temperature. And then we move on to our specialty strains of yeast like we have over here. So your distiller strains. Now, the distiller strains of yeast have been designed to work at higher temperatures, ferment quicker, and give you a result in a shorter period of time, higher ABV. So higher ABV in your wash means more product off the still. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean higher ABV off the still, but that's a subject for another video. So this yeast here works from 33 degrees to 36 degrees. So you will see that yes, it works at a higher temperature range, but the temperature range has now decreased to about 4 degrees, where these ones have about a 10 degree play that you can play around with. This one has 4 degrees. So it becomes more finicky at the end of the day. But yes, you will get better flavors, you will get a better and cleaner fermentation and all those other things when you use a specialty yeast. But remember, it becomes more finicky and it takes a little bit more effort to get that product into your still. Okay, like I said, one of the big reasons a distillation fails is a failed fermentation. Oh, lovely. Okay, now we move into our liquid culture yeast. Now this yeast is designed to produce very high ABV. It's also called a high gravity yeast. This specific one has a very cool name. It's called supermassive black hole. That just means that it's going to consume so much sugar that you do not know where the sugar is going. So I love the name of this yeast. But if you look on the side here, the temperature range that this can run at is 18 to 23 degrees centigrade. So once again, it is about a 5 degree play. Anything below 18, it starts slowing, or not starts slowing down, the fermentation stops. Anything above 23 degrees and the yeast starts slowing down once again, or the fermentation stops. So you have a very narrow window that you need to control the temperature for these yeasts to produce an optimal range. Okay, so if you think of it in terms that I understand, over here you have your daily drivers, you have your insert your name brand of car here, you have a Toyota Corolla. Okay, the Toyota Corolla that you have over here will get you to work and back for many years without having issues. It's cheap to maintain, it's easy to run, and it is relatively simple to use. Okay, there's not a lot of finicky bits in it, and it works. Over here you have a Hilux bucky. It is robust. It works in many conditions. If you turn the ignition, it starts, and you can keep it together with duct tape and Q20. So it works. It works in many conditions. Yes, you will not be able to get the result that you get from here, but it is one of those. Okay, it's a very easy, quick, simple, and reliable source. Okay, now you move into your fancy motor vehicles over here. You're moving into your Ferraris, Porsches, that type of stuff. Now those cars are beautiful, they're brilliant, and they work, but they need a lot of upkeep and a lot of attention. If you start neglecting them, they will die on you, same as the cars. These ones over here, you can play around with them, you can abuse them a little bit, and they will still produce. These ones over here, the moment you stop paying attention to them, they start dying. Okay, cool. So that's the easiest analogy I can think of. Over here, you have, and I keep repeating this, you have your simple, easy, quick yeast that once you put it into the wash, it will do what it's supposed to do without having to be very finicky and control the temperature and all that other funny stuff. Over here, you have the yeast that needs temperature control. Some of these, like these high ABV or super high gravity yeasts, they need to be step fed. So that means adding little bits of sugar, but that's once again another video for another day. So it is not as simple as this. Okay, cool. So after a lot of rambling, it's time to get into our continuous yeast producing job. If you have any questions on yeast, please pop it down. If you have any other things to say about yeast, please pop it down in the description box, and I will be glad to answer your questions and that type of stuff. If you disagree with anything I say, please put it down in the comments and we can discuss it. And just a quick synopsis, there's nothing wrong with any of these yeasts. Depending on what you want to do and what equipment you have available or your equipment that you have at your disposal, some of these yeasts will produce better than the other yeasts. Some of them will produce more alcohol, some of them will produce less alcohol. But at the end of the day, it depends on what equipment you have available and how you treat your yeast. Like I will say again, is I do not stress my yeast. Baker's yeast, 6%. Brewers yeast, 12%. This yeast here, I'll work to the manufacturer's recommendation of 15%. This yeast here, I'll work to the manufacturer's recommendation of 25%. Simple as that. I do not want to stress my yeast. It will just prolong the fermentation. It will just increase the risk of the fermentation not finishing and problems. Simple. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to finish up this continuous yeast producing jar. Now, you saw me in a video breaking my previous one, so it's time to make a new one. So what I've done is I've inverted the sugars. Now, inverting the sugar just means we are splitting the fructose and the glucose from each other and making it easier for the yeast to consume it. Okay, so you have a little bit of sugar in a lot of water. You do not want to make an alcoholic concoction. You want to make an environment where the yeast can reproduce and make more babies and keep on making babies, and you just take off the yeast every couple of days, and depending on how much you want to use. Okay, so step 1, invert your sugars. Step 2, fill your jar with 2 liters of water. Now if you taste this water, it should not taste sweet at all. You might get a little hint of sugar, but you do not want it to taste sweet. Remember, we're not making a sugar wash. We are making a yeast starter. Next up, I like my yeast combo of my brewer's yeast versus my bread yeast. So I will be doing half brewer, half bread in this wash here. So remember to sanitize everything, because you don't want any other buggies or something coming in contact with this. So we're not going to use the whole packet. Remember, this is only 2 liters. So we are just going to use a little bit. So what I normally do is I sprinkle it on top of the jar and allow it to form a carpet on top, and that should be sufficient yeast to start producing a colony. And then you keep this for your next batch. Same as with the brewer's yeast. So we're just going to put enough on top to coat the top layer. If you have a big jar, yeah, you're going to probably use all of it, but yeah, just a thin layer. Now what we're going to do is we're just going to stir this up to get all the yeast nice and incorporated. We are going to put the lid on like this. We're not going to clamp it down because this is going to produce CO2, and the CO2 is heavier than air, so it is going to push the air out. So you don't have to put an airlock on here. So yeah, let's get to stirring. Okay, so once you have stirred it all up, your yeast should all be nice and rehydrated in this sugary, liquidy wash. Next up, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to aerate this wash while the yeast is inside here, and give it a little bit of air, because yeast loves oxygen in the beginning in an aerobic situation where it reproduces at a rapid rate. So this jar here becomes overrun by yeast. Okay, so that's a quick aeration. It's not a lot, just a little bit. If you have a fish tank pump, air pump, you can put the air stone in there, leave it in there for a bit longer, and that will now aerate the wash. What we're going to do now is we're going to leave it like that. We're going to leave it in this exact position for 2 days. After 2 days, what you're going to do is you're going to pour half of the liquid into 4 jars. You're going to open the lid, you're going to stir it up, you're going to pour that all mixed up liquid into these jars. Once these jars are at about a cup, so about 250 mils, you're going to put into here. You are going to top this up once again with the same liquid water that you made previously with the sugar, the inverted sugar and normal water, and you're going to top it up to that level again, and you're going to leave it to reproduce. In about 3 days, you're going to, or 2 or 3 days, you are going to take off another batch of yeast up until you have enough jars that you want. I generally try and get about 8 jars. That gives me 8 fermentations in the fridge. What I do then is I top this up with the water. I then close the lid, put it into the fridge, and allow it to become chilled and get the yeast to go dormant. Once I get to the last 2 jars of my yeast, I will just repeat the process. Take this out of the fridge, get it up to room temperature, get all the yeast nice and active again. I will stir it up, decant into 4 jars, top it up with water, fill it up with our water and sugar again, leave it for 3 days until I have 8 jars again, and I'll just keep doing that, and that yeast on the inside here will just keep reproducing and reproducing and eating the sugars and making more and more and more and more yeast, up until at the end of the day it just stops. Okay, so after a while it will stop producing and the yeast will, the colony will start dying down, and then all you do is you repeat the process from right at the beginning, creating a brand new jar and using your yeast again. So it is a very simple process to reuse your yeast or to extend your yeast. If you have a very special yeast that you like to use, then yeah, you can do this process and you can extend your yeast. If you have any questions on the jar or the process was a little bit unclear, please let me know down in the comments and I will type out a nice and long instruction on how we make our yeast starters. Okay, so just to recap before we leave off and get into all the fun stuff of making washes and distilling again. This stays outside with the lid ajar, not open, just like that, so the CO2 can escape, or else you're going to create a little bit of a bomb. Okay, you don't want that. Yes, the seal will fail first and but you don't want that. So you just want to leave it open like this, and this will now just plop up and down and release the CO2. Okay, so it stays outside for 3 days. You decant. After 3 days, you fill it up after you decant it, and I do it about twice. So in a 6-day period, I will create 8 of these little jars that I leave in the fridge. So once these are decanted, I put them straight into the fridge, close the lid nice and tight in the fridge, and you will see a clear liquid starting to form on top. You'll have a little bit of a milky layer, and then you'll have a sediment at the bottom, and that is your yeast, your liquid yeast that you're going to use. And yeah, I'll just use one of these jars on a 20-liter batch. Before I start the process, I'll open it up. I'll leave it outside, close to where I am, to get it up to room temperature before I pitch it. And then I pitch it into my wash when I'm done preparing it. Check over on my Instagram. I will be posting the progress of this over on Instagram and on TikTok. Okay, so thank you very much once again for joining me on this episode. If you stuck around to the end here, thank you very much.